Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session of LitFestx titled Can Popular Cinema Be Taken Seriously? We have with us Jay Arjun Singh. Jay is an independent writer and critic. His books include Jaane Bhi Do Yaro, Seriously Funny Since 1983, about the cult comedy film by the same name, and his other book, The Popcorn Essayists. Jay writes a widely read culture blog, very interestingly titled Jabberwock. And his latest book is titled The World of Hrishikesh Mukerji, the filmmaker everyone loves. And it's about director Hrishikesh Mukerji and his films like Anand, Golmaal, Khoobsurat, and a few others. Jay, welcome to LitFestx.
Thanks, Kumar. Thanks very much for having me. And it's a relief to be doing a festival like this sitting at home right at the start of the LitFest season when things are about to get chaotic. So thanks for this.
Thank you. So at the outset, I must say, since we are discussing, cinema and your book is on the same subject, I can't help but comment on your lovely shirt you're wearing. It's got a very filmy appeal to it. So maybe that will add to the flavor of the session for our viewers live as well as in the video later on.
Well, it's not as colorful as the shirts worn by characters in some Hrishikesh Mukerji films like Amol Palekar in Golmaal and Amitabh Bachchan in Namak Haram, but I do my best.
So maybe you're going in that direction in any case. Yeah. So on your latest book, Jay, you've given a very interesting dedication at the beginning of the book. Would you want to read us that dedication for our viewers to get a context of what we are talking about?
Yeah, sure. I'll do that. The book is here. The dedication is the first part of it is fairly predictable, which is for anyone who has ever loved a Hrishikesh Mukerji film. But the second part of it is, and to everyone who is smart enough to take popular cinema seriously. So I've actually been questioned quite a bit about that, but I think it has a lot to do with my own feelings that too often popular films, call them commercial, mainstream films, and this applies to literature as well, not just cinema, tends not to get taken very seriously. It tends to be either dismissed outright or approved of on very conditional terms and patronized almost as something that is only mere entertainment and can possibly have no other sort of value. So that's really one of the things I had in mind when I wrote that dedication.
Okay. So, when you say, to be taken seriously, tell us a little bit more. I mean, how should the average moviegoer or fan who's enjoying a fun film, like let's say a Chupke Chupke, which you've talked about, which is really a fun film. There is on the face of it there is no social message, or on the face of it there isn't an agenda or a hard-hitting storyline, right? I mean, it's fun all the way.
Yeah.
So what in your view is there to be taken seriously? How do you want users to take such films seriously?
Well, I should start by saying, I'm glad you brought up Chupke Chupke in particular, because that's a very good example for the sort of thing that I'm talking about. But I'd also want to start by saying that I'm not trying to play a killjoy here. Chupke Chupke, speaking specifically about a film like that, or Golmaal, these are movies that should first and foremost just be enjoyed at the level of what they are. They are fun films, warm, affirmative, enjoyable movies with these wonderful characters and dialogues and so on. So it's definitely not my intention to get pedantic right at the outset and tell people, no, you have to sit and think about the deeper meanings. You don't. You absolutely don't. If you're content to just sit back and enjoy the film, that's perfectly fine. My own, I have so many favorite scenes in Chupke Chupke where I'm not even thinking about deeper meanings. But the thing is that at the same time, for people who take cinema seriously, as viewers or as readers or as writers, you need to be able to engage even with what is on the surface a really frothy and light-hearted movie. Now, and I'll give you an example. Chupke Chupke, for I mean, I'm sure pretty much anyone who's watching this would know something about it. But it's the epitome of the middle class film of the 1970s. Here, the main storyline has uh, a professor of botany dressing up as a driver and working in his wife's house and confounding her brother-in-law in the process. And there's a lot of hasi mazak, as we put it. But at the same time, this jovial framework is used to very interestingly comment on the class divide in Indian society. You have a scene, for instance, where the protagonist, Parimal, he's dressed in the driver's uniform and he goes into an old friend's office. And the friend just sort of looks up at him, looks straight at him for a second or two, and then looks down again and just thinks, here's a driver who's come. He registers only the uniform. He doesn't register the person there. He doesn't even recognize his own body until much later in the scene. You have moments like that. You have a film like this that's a lot of fun to watch all the way through, but is also giving you a look at what can happen to a particular society when some of its safety nets fall away and when the class lines become very blurred. A lot of the scandal within the film's narrative is that this middle class woman is becoming too chummy and too cozy with the family driver because nobody knows that the driver is really her husband. So it becomes an occasion for scandal. And of course, everything turns out well in the end, and it reaches for an affirmative, comforting, socially approved ending. But along the way, in the course of the film's narrative, a lot of little ideas have been brought to the surface and presented there for the viewer to consider. Now, a popular film like Chupke Chupke will do things in this way. A more hard-hitting film, a more obviously serious, radical, hard-edged film will perhaps be a little more obvious about these things and perhaps just spell the message out in a much clearer way and maybe even end on a not very happy note where you're setting out to make the viewer uncomfortable. Hrishikesh Mukerji did not belong to that type of cinema. What he did was more comforting, more mainstream, more popular, warmer, but his films also had their own ways of making people think about society, about relationships, and so on.
So let's talk a little bit more about Hrishikesh Mukherjee, since you've tracked him very closely and his work. What kind of relevance do you think his films would have with the current generation? Both in their existing shape and form, and let's say if some of those narratives were to be retold by modern filmmakers.
Well, Kumar, many of the films, as it happens, have been remade in recent times, but with very mixed results. Because I think the general perception is that most of the filmmakers who have done remakes of films like Khoobsurat, for instance, or even Golmaal, haven't really found the Hrishikesh Mukerji tone, that particular warmth that was there in those films. Now, of course, I won't comment on that too much, but you asked about relevance. I have what might be a very general answer to that question, which is that in my view, any really good film, any really well-made film is automatically relevant regardless of whether the subject matter of the film or the setting that the film deals with or the types of characters that the film deals with, even if they start to seem a bit outdated or belonging to the past at some point. Hypothetically, for instance, you might say that in today's India, in the post-liberalization India, we no longer quite have the types of characters that Hrishikesh Mukerji dealt with in the 1970s in films like Golmaal and Chupke Chupke. Now that itself would be a very simplistic view, but just assuming for a second that's true, the fact is the films are still, his best work is still so good that just by virtue of being well made, it adds to our cinematic heritage, it adds to our legacy, and it becomes relevant in that sense. Otherwise, in a more particular sense, to answer your question, these films, the best of them, deal with universal human emotions and relationships. He is often very sharp about the workings of society, the class lines, the relationship between men and women in a somewhat conservative society where radical change doesn't really happen very fast, but there are little ways in which battles can be won, where gender equality can be achieved, for instance. These are things that his cinema dealt with. And all that is, of course, very relevant today as well, and it will always continue to be relevant.
Tell me, you've been writing about films and cinema both in your blogs and in your books as well. Um, tell us a little bit about film books in general. I mean, there's a certain perception that serious readers are not going to buy film books, or some of them land up as coffee table books, which are very good to look at, very graphically well represented, but sometimes maybe with not enough serious content.
Right.
Now, what has been your experience on that front, and how are you approaching this differently?
Well, I should say first, coffee table books obviously sort of occupy a very specific niche, and of course, a coffee table book, like anything else, can be well done or poorly done. But I have no problem with a coffee table book, for instance, or even a book of trivia, a book that explicitly positions itself as a book that contains trivia, anecdotes, fun reading. I have no problem with such books. They can be extremely well done and fulfill the function that they set out to achieve. But I think that there's been a major lack of in Indian publishing, at least in Indian publishing in English, which is the field that I know most about, is the intelligent but accessible film book, where there's a certain amount of analysis, there's a lot of thought and consideration that's gone into thinking about films, right? Analyzing them, analyzing little things about them, and so on, but also presenting all that information in fairly accessible, friendly language. Which means, of course, that I'm not talking about highly academic books, which again cater to a specific niche of their own. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the sort of book that, and this is something that I tried to do with both the Janivi Doyarum book and the Hrishikesh Mukerji book. I don't know how far I succeeded, but I tried to write both books as a narrative with a clear beginning, a middle, and an end. So ideally, an engaged reader of these books would really want to start reading the book right at the beginning and just continue reading it all the way through, rather than doing what you might do with a film magazine, for instance. You just sort of pick it up and just open it anywhere and let your eyes fall on 2 or 3 paras that will have some interesting anecdote or trivia or whatever. Now, it's fine to have that sort of light reading as well. But what I've been trying to do with my books, and the sort of film writing that I personally find most stimulating, is the one where you have a narrative. You're attempting to have a flowing narrative and write it with all the rigor that you would write a book about anything else, about a supposedly more important subject like politics or whatever. You need to have that rigor in film writing, and I hope we have more of that. Frankly, I think there's a lot of scope for improvement in the regular film criticism that we have as well in mainstream publications and magazines and newspapers. I think we only have 4 or 5 really high quality critics whose work I would be happy to read anytime, which is a bit of a pity.
So on that topic, tell us a little bit about your anthology as well, since you've taken work from a variety of different sort of very well-known writers, and
Right.
many of whom have not traditionally known to be writing about cinema. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, this anthology is called the Popcorn Essays. It was published around 4 years ago. The idea that we had for this anthology, as you said just now, is that we didn't want professional film writers to contribute the essays. We wanted the essayists to be well-known writers, and we got many of the finest writers in the country. Even if I say so myself, people like Manjula Padmanabhan and Anjum Hassan and Musharraf Ali Faruqi, of course, who's Pakistani, but very much one of our own in terms of his writing sensibilities. Writers like that, and the idea really was to have people who did not habitually write about cinema, to have them think about a particular film or a particular film experience that intersected with their lives in a really interesting way and stimulated them in some way, or made their lives more meaningful in some way. So that was the thought behind that. And again, the results, even though I say so myself, were very satisfying and very thrilling. And I did an essay for the book myself, which was about my love for horror films, but that's another matter.
So about your love for horror films, you said.
Yeah.
That's a interesting thing to know, Jay. I mean, at one hand, you've been talking about all these fun and popular, light-hearted movies like Golmaal, or the Hrishikesh Mukerji movies, and then you're a horror film buff. How are you managing very disparate tastes in cinema?
I don't know. I'm a very versatile viewer, is all I can say. but there actually is a connection or a link, if you think about it, which is that the same way that popular cinema tends to get dismissed quite easily or not always taken seriously, horror films, horror is one genre that is often on the receiving end of a lot of condescension, because what happens is, and it's very interesting in some ways, that even with the best horror films, or even with so-so horror films that have some good moments in them, there's one phenomenon which I find very interesting, which is that people, when they're sitting in the dark hall watching the film, if it's reasonably well made, they will be reacting exactly as the director or the writer wanted them to react. They'll be jumping in their seats, they'll be covering their eyes and so on. All their emotions will be in this fraught state. And so they've basically experienced the film as a film should be experienced. They've been affected by it. But then they come out of the hall, 5 minutes later they are in broad daylight, and now things are more settled, and then they start criticizing the film and laughing at it and saying, oh, it was so shoddy, and वैसी था, ना मजा था, और कुछ नहीं था. Whereas I think horror, again, this is a pity, because horror is the ability to be scared is one of the most primal and most fundamental of human emotions. And if a film can do that to you in a darkened hall, then that is very much part of the magic of cinema and what a film can do, put us in touch with some of our more atavistic emotions. Which is another reason why I find it a little unfortunate that many people are condescending towards horror films as well. I try to write about these things in my essay, but in a sense, it again ties into the subject of this session about popular cinema and about the need to take certain things seriously, even if on the face of it they aren't very profound or meaningful.
So you hit on something interesting. In recent times we've had some popular movies which have done extremely well and which have also had very upfront strong social messages. So take, for example, Three Idiots from Rajkumar Hirani, or even the Munna Bhai series to a certain extent, and or PK, or a few other films in the same genre. Do you think now, with such examples and consistently over the last 5 or 6 years, do you think now we've come to a point where some filmmakers have found that sweet spot where they are making popular films, or let's say films which are meant for popular viewing with a lot of fun element in it, but also have a very strong social message or a takeaway right at the core of it?
Yeah, absolutely, Kumar. You mentioned Rajkumar Hirani. Now, interestingly enough, Rajkumar Hirani is a huge fan of Hrishikesh Mukerji. And he often references Hrishikesh Mukerji in his own work. And in fact, many people would say that films like the Munna Bhai films or PK, or the films that you mentioned, are are in some ways direct inheritors of the Hrishikesh Mukerji legacy. Films that are warm and lots of fun to watch, but also have certain things to say. Uh, but I would also go a step further, which is that one thing that's happened in the multiplex culture, as we call it now, the the multiplex viewing culture of the last 10, 12 years, it's become possible for many films that back in the 1970s they would have been considered art films or non-mainstream films, and they might have released in one or two halls and then gone off after a week, and then maybe found a new life on video cassette many years later. But many of those types of films, when they are being made today, thanks to the multiplex culture, they tend to find their audiences. Because now we have halls where the seating space might just be 200 people as compared to 20 years ago. So it's possible for even a small film or a non-mainstream film or an indie film to run for a few weeks and then to find its own audience through the DVD circuit after that. So as a result, the line between popular and non-mainstream has become a little blurred in the last few years. So even now, you mentioned Rajkumar Hirani. He is still a fairly big budget filmmaker, but even some of the better indie films of the last year, films like Masan, for instance, or Caught, which has been submitted for the Oscar nomination, films that are much more overtly serious films, grounded, realistic films, even they are finding their audiences, largish audiences, in a way that such films may not have found big audiences 30 years ago. So in that sense, I think things are changing quite a bit.
Okay, interesting. And so at this point in time, I think we'll take in a few questions from the online audience. I'm seeing a stream of questions, directed at you. So the first one is, it says, it's from a certain Mr. Oran, Mr. or Miss, I'm not sure. It says, I strongly believe that any kind of writing where characters and situations are involved is filmmaking. And then he says, do you see it in your works?
Any kind of writing where characters and situations are involved
is filmmaking, and he wants to know, do you see that in your works?
In my works? Yeah. Well, I don't know about characters and situations because I'm not a fiction writer. Sure. I've never really sort of done any fiction of any quality at all. I've stuck to the fields of criticism and non-fiction mostly. So I'm not really sure if that question would apply to me. And to be honest, I didn't really completely get it.
No worries.
But I think it would apply more to a fiction writer or a creative writer, perhaps.
Right. We've got one which says, which filmmakers and films do you find the most gripping in terms of bringing about a social change in India?
In terms of bringing about a social change in India, now again, that's a very difficult question to answer. Are we talking about contemporary filmmakers?
The question is very wide. I think, if there are any...
Well, it could be social change again is something that's it's a difficult thing to define because, that again, coming back to the larger theme of this session, a popular film or a mainstream film can, if it's well done, if it delineates its characters and situations well, it can, in its own way, make society a better place by sensitizing people to certain things. Whereas the more hard-edged or the more arty or indie films that set out to create a social message more explicitly, those films belong to a different category altogether. But to answer your question, there are many people. There's right from Bimal Roy to Shyam Benegal. There have been many filmmakers like that. And it just depends mainly on what your definition of social change is.
Right. We'll just take one last question. It is from someone called Astha. And her question is, Jay, your love towards Bollywood is well known. What intrigues you towards writing about the making of films?
I have done that one book about Jani Bhi Do Yaron, which was largely about the making of it. Apart from that, I haven't. It's not like I've done a lot of writing specifically about the making of films. I mean, most of my writing is still analytical after watching a film and so on. But if there's a film that I really love, or a film that I find stimulating in some way or the other, then it's a natural human response to want to learn things about what was going on in the heads of the directors or the writers or the cinematographers, what the backstories about a particular scene may have been. So something like that is always it just depends on your level of engagement with the movie and how interesting the making of the film might have been. When I wrote the Jani Bhi Do Yaron book, I spoke with Kundan Shah, the writer-director, very early on. And within a couple of days of meeting him, I knew that there was this treasure trove of interesting stories about the making of that film. Right from the use of a real dead rat as a prop, to the fact that Nasiruddin Shah got so angry at some point during the making of the film because he didn't understand what was going on that he refused to have his meals. And he threw a very starry sort of tantrum on the sets. So you have all those interesting anecdotes, but it really varies from film to film, I suppose.
Great, great. So that brings us to the end of the session, Jay. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you. And I'm sure at maybe some other point in time, we'd love to have another session with you, getting into the nitty-gritties of some of the movies that you've covered. But with paucity of time, we'll end it for now. And, we hope you've had a great experience with LitFestx. For us, the experience is just, you staring into the screen, and, hearing my voice. That's about all the experience we can provide you, I guess.
It's been wonderful, Kumar. Thanks a lot for organizing this. And like I said, I wasn't joking when I said that it's a relief to do a lit fest like this instead of one where you're being shoved around by a lot of people all the time.
Absolutely. Well, thanks a lot, and we hope that your latest book does really well.
Thanks.
Bye bye.
Bye.